Well, welcome everybody to February's A20 Sustainability Series Forum. Tonight is kind of a special night for a few reasons. Most importantly, because we are having a guest host by Citizens Climate Lobby, who will be moderating and hosting this sustainability forum for us. So we're excited to have him in the house. Round of applause. Thank you. Another special reason, because we, of course, are facing another winter weather storm that has forced us into a position to do virtual only. If you have joined us before on these, you know that we've been doing virtual for the last couple of years, but that in 2023, we were so excited to partner with the Ann Arbor District Library downtown location so that we could have a hybrid event for these. We're all planning to have our hosts in person tonight, as well as streaming this online. But unfortunately, the ice that is covering the trees has prevented us from being in person. We thought it was safer to just go all virtual. So thanks for being flexible, everyone, and joining us online tonight. I'm going to give a brief overview of the sustainability series. I will invite you to next month's as well, where we will be exploring some of the new opportunities that have opened up through the federal Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to be looking at electrification in your home, what kind of heat pumps and other appliances you can use to move towards electric sources in your home. So join us for that. We've got a few more actually. Even after that, we'll be looking at renewable energy in April, and then we'll be looking at carbon reductions and broader resources in May. So these series happen the last Wednesday of every month for the first 4 or 5 months of the year. So we've got an exciting lineup for you this year. Please join us at future ones. I will, at this point, hand it over to Ginny Rogers with CCL to introduce her team and to moderate the rest of this event. Thank you so much for joining us, Ginny.
Thanks. Actually, I'm going to just turn it right over to Clark to give a very brief introduction to CCL and then introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Zach. And thank everyone for connecting in. As Zach said, tonight's forum was organized by the Ann Arbor Citizens Climate Lobby chapter in cooperation with the City of Ann Arbor's Office of Sustainability and Innovation. CCL is a national, nonpartisan, grassroots advocacy organization focused on educating and advocating for effective action to address climate change. CCL has over 500 chapters throughout the world, 16 in Michigan. If you'd like to join or find out more, you can attend a monthly meeting or find us on Facebook or on the web at annarborccl.org. The format for tonight will be each panelist will present for 15 minutes, and at the conclusion of the presentations, the panelists will be available for questions. While the panelists are speaking, you can submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll be getting these questions ready for the Q&A period, which we expect to start about 7:15. We may not get to all the questions, so please take down our email address and contact us if you'd like to join a further discussion. So thanks to our experts, we have some very interesting information to hear tonight. Our first speaker is Jonathan Levine. Jonathan Levine is a professor of urban and regional planning in the Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, where he has served since 1991. He teaches and researches at the nexus of transportation and land use planning and is the author of Zoned Out: Regulation, Markets, and Choices in Transportation and Metropolitan Land Use, and From Mobility to Accessibility, Transforming Urban Transportation and Land Use Planning. He holds a PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome, Dr. Ewing, or Dr. Levine.
Thanks very much, Clark. And thanks to the organizers, and it's great to be here. I wish we were face to face, but I'm very glad to have this alternative. When it comes to municipal action and climate change, I want to bring some bad news, some good news, and maybe some better news. Is everybody seeing my screen? Great. So here's the bad news. The bad news is what municipalities control directly is, when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, is a drop in the bucket compared to the emissions that are associated with people who live, work, and play in the cities. The good news, however, is that the share of carbon emissions that come from transportation and residential and commercial, in other words, heating and cooling our buildings, is a large majority of the share of carbon emissions in the United States. Why is this good news? Well, it's good news because so much of what cities do actually influences both transportation emissions and building emissions. This is right at the heart of municipal action. The better news is that cities themselves are wonderful tools for mitigating carbon emissions. Cities are, I could say, low carbon zones, but that would be a little too self-satisfied. Let's call them lower carbon zones. Here I'm going to be using some data from the Cool Climate Network of UC Berkeley that does its best to model per household carbon emissions by location. And the patterns are really remarkable. Households that live in cities emit roughly half of households that live in some of the more remote suburbs, making cities themselves an incredible carbon mitigation tool. This goes for our neighbor Chicago. This goes for San Francisco. Note the blue in the central area, the orange in the more outlying areas. This goes for New York City and its suburbs, and it goes for our very own Ann Arbor, where emissions in the center of Ann Arbor are clearly about half of what they are in some of the outlying locations. The difference is actually very significant. The magnitude is huge. Here I'm comparing emissions in per household in downtown Ann Arbor, the smallest left-hand bars, versus the city of Ann Arbor, versus downtown Ann Arbor versus central Ann Arbor zip 48104, if most of us know Ann Arbor geography, versus the entire city, versus the suburban locations of Saline. What we see is that the magnitude of the carbon savings associated with living in a central area is really very significant. It's made up primarily of differences in car fuel and differences in electricity and natural gas. And I'm going to come back to this momentarily. The transportation differences that are associated with location, we can think of as broken up into two. One is the non-automotive share of the commute. So in other words, of the journey to work, what share goes by public transportation, walking, and bicycling? And what we can see in Ann Arbor, it's in the mid-20s, whereas in the suburban locations of Saline and Dexter, it's pretty much under 5% or even lower than that. In other words, you have a much higher probability of walking, cycling, or taking the bus to work if you live in Ann Arbor. By the way, if this is sounding like self-congratulation, It's actually going to be the opposite. So hold on for why we Ann Arborites should not be self-satisfied with these results. The second component of the transportation effect is the vehicle miles traveled effect, how long you travel. I mention this because often it's discussed in the debate locally. Well, if we develop high density in town, the people will still have cars. Well, indeed, many of the people will still have cars, but statistically, the amount that they'll drive is going to be so much less than it would be if they were to live in other locations that even if acknowledging that they'll still drive, I think we still see a significant locational effect. The third big effect is the energy use of buildings, how much energy it takes to heat and cool our buildings. What we know is that if you're an apartment or a condominium, if you're an attached construction, you use about half the energy of single-family homes. So in central locations, there's two things. There's first of all a higher proportion of multi-unit buildings, and even the single-family homes tend to be smaller. Then they tend to be in the outlying areas. So for all that, the locational advantage of the city is, again, really very significant. Now, I mentioned that we ought not to be self-satisfied in Ann Arbor, because if we're a low carbon zone, we ought to make sure that people can live in our lower carbon zone and not push them into higher carbon zones. So what does it mean? How do we push people into higher carbon zones? Well, I would offer that with our zoning and other land use regulatory tools, we impose in so many cases a low density, often suburban auto-oriented template. And in a central location like Ann Arbor that has the capacity to provide these benefits, both in terms of transportation and in terms of building energy, what that amounts to is reducing the number of people who can live in our lower carbon zone and pushing them into higher carbon zones. In other words, not getting the full carbon mitigation advantage of the location that we enjoy here in Ann Arbor. Fine, people will say, but we want to make sure that we have a high quality of life. How does one maintain livability when densities are relatively high? The answer here is also good news, because higher density development turns out to be more fiscally productive. It's a very simple reason why. Infrastructure and services are very expensive. When infrastructure and services are shared among more individuals and more households, their cost comes down. So what these examples show is the net fiscal productivity of central and higher density areas in a couple of cities, not Ann Arbor, but this is the case of Lafayette, Indiana, and Eugene, Oregon, where the higher density areas end up subsidizing the lower density areas in terms of their net fiscal impact on the city. What this allows is for a virtuous cycle where higher density generates greater fiscal solvency, and the greater fiscal solvency can be used for investments that render the higher density more livable. What does that mean? That would be high quality infrastructure, high quality services, higher quality parks and open space. So the fiscal solvency of higher densities allows us to invest in a more amenable and more safer and more livable environment. Okay, fine, but we're not interested in a more sustainable environment just for rich people. what about the question of housing affordability? Well, I think the news here is also good. First off, I'd like to make the distinction between affordable housing and affordable living. Really, we don't have any affordable housing problem in the United States. There's plenty of affordable housing. It happens to be in places that's so remote that you can't feasibly live there and reach the destinations you'd want to reach. Affordable living incorporates the cost of housing and the cost of transportation. Here, the news is also good when it comes to affordability, because transportation is the second largest budget in people's second largest item in people's household budgets. If we can save people costs in transportation, we're helping to make the living a lot more affordable. And here we can see the annual transportation costs by location, comparing downtown Ann Arbor to the more suburban locations. Again, the differences are really very significant. The second distinction I'd like to make when it comes to affordable housing is the difference between affordable housing and housing affordability. Affordable housing refers to housing that can be paid for by households earning some proportion of the area median income, 80%, 60%, 40%, and stressing their budgets with no more than 30% of their monthly income. Housing affordability, by contrast, is relevant up and down the income spectrum. So there are people who certainly do not qualify for subsidized housing for whom housing affordability is an issue. The impact of lack of housing affordability, and I would offer that we suffer that in Ann Arbor, is seen, for example, in excessively long commutes. More extreme examples would be homelessness or delayed household formation, but often what we see is people driving too long to attempt to reach housing that they're able to afford. The final thing I want to talk about is the migration chain. It's often noted that new market rate housing comes in at high prices, and that's absolutely true. People will say, well, how could it possibly be relevant to housing affordability, since you have to be quite affluent to live in that new housing? And the answer is this has been a very researched subject, and there is something called a migration chain. Effectively, when you drop a new housing unit into a metropolitan area, you trigger a move. You trigger a move from an existing housing unit. Call it housing unit B moved into housing unit A, or household B moved into housing unit A. Now household C moves into housing unit B. Household D moves into housing unit C. This is something that's documented with research, and what's really interesting is that with each step in the chain tends to move down the income spectrum. So even new market rate housing that tends to come in at the high end of the spectrum ultimately triggers a freeing up of housing at lower than the median and even in the bottom quintile of income. This is not trickle-down economics. Instead, this is a process that happens actually very, very rapidly in the case of it in the span of months or a maximum a couple of years. So I'd like to offer that that new housing development is relevant both to our climate goals and very much to our affordability goals by lifting supply constraints. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to our next speaker, which I believe to be Reid Ewing, who's going to be introduced.
Yes, I'll say a few words. Reid Ewing is our next speaker. He's Distinguished Professor of City and Metropolitan Planning at the University of Utah. He's Associate Editor of Cities and columnist for Planning magazine. With a master's from Harvard, his PhD is in urban planning and transportation systems from MIT. Reid's 12 books include Pedestrian and Transit-Oriented Design, Growing Cooler, Evidence of Urban Development and Climate Change, and best development practices listed by the American Planning Association as one of the 100 essential books in planning over the past 100 years. Welcome, Dr. Ewing.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm with you from snowy Salt Lake City. I was planning to fly in this morning and was told by my sister, Constance Connie Cook, that I should not, because you are going to have an ice storm. And so here I sit with my beagles, and I hope they don't disrupt. I'm talking about a book. It's called Growing Cooler, that was mentioned by Clark. This is what it looks like. It was funded by EPA in the mid 2000s. So it goes back a ways. It's the first major work written from a planner's perspective on climate change. And in those days, planners weren't thinking about climate change much, or at least their role in mitigating climate change. So it's my talk is going to be two parts. One is the evidence, which is in the title of the book, and it's very consonant with Jonathan's talk. And the other is a case study of Portland, if I have time to do that. So transportation CO2, which Jonathan talked about when he talked about vehicle miles traveled and walk share of trips, is a three-legged stool. One leg is vehicles and their efficiency in miles per gallon. A second is fuels on their carbon content, and you can compare, for example, electric cars to gas-powered cars, and of course the gas-powered cars produce a lot more carbon. And then the third leg is VMT, which Jonathan talked about, vehicle miles traveled. And as they say, you can't sit on a stool with fewer than three legs. So all three legs are important. And where urban planners come in to the picture is mostly in terms of VMT. And I think Jonathan did a wonderful job talking about, VMT if you live in the city of Ann Arbor versus an outlying suburb. So this shows you the prognosis for 2030 in terms of how much carbon or CO2 would be emitted. And we assumed when we did this chart that the carbon content of fuel would go down by 20%. And the efficiency of vehicles by 2030 would be at 50 miles per gallon. And the overall CO2 would be down a little bit compared to 2005, but not much, down much, because of the VMT, vehicle miles traveled. And that relates to sprawl. Jonathan mentioned the suburbs. I'm talking not about all suburbs, but sprawling suburbs. There are good compact developments in the suburbs, and there's sprawl in cities. So the VMT is mostly a result of sprawl. And you can see that the blue line is above the red line at the bottom, which is our target line. If we're going to reduce CO2 by 80% relative to 1995, or early 2000s, we're going to have to get the VMT down. And so what my book did was review the evidence on VMT, and in sprawling regions like Knoxville and Atlanta, VMT is about 35% higher than it is in compact regions like San Francisco and Honolulu. So that's one source of evidence that the built environment makes a big difference. And it's not a function of income, which obviously affects, or fuel price, which obviously affect how much VMT you produce. It's a function of the built environment, sprawl versus compact. This is another source of evidence. We have literally hundreds of articles on household travel and the effect of the built environment on that. And if you compare, and this is one of many comparisons in the book, if you compare Southern Village outside Chapel Hill, which is dense, mixed use, to the Scarborough neighborhoods, which are a little farther from downtown Chapel Hill, but on the left, you see they're single-use cul-de-sac communities. In other words, sprawl. There's a 40% difference in VMT. We also have regional simulations that have been done across the country. We did a paper on what are called scenario plans in different regions. And on the left, it's Sacramento. On the left, you have a base case scenario for 2050, I believe. And it's sprawling outward from the center of Sacramento. On the right is the preferred scenario that came out of this particular study. And you can see it's much more compact. And the difference in VMT between them is 26%. So you have a 35%, you've got a 40%, now you've got a 26%, and those are all big numbers. This is the fourth source of evidence we have. There are simulations, again, using models, comparing Atlantic Station, which is in Atlanta, in central Atlanta, to the same developments if they're outlying, and in Henry County, for example, or in Sandy Springs. And the difference is a third. Just having Atlantic Station, which is mixed use and dense, in the center of Atlanta, it makes about a third difference in how much VMT is produced by the same development in one location versus another. So we have four sources of evidence, and they're all pointing in about the same direction, that dense mixed-use development in the center of the region produces that much less VMT. So the answer to the first question, which I didn't ask but will now, is what difference does the built environment make? In the book, came up with a range from 20 to 40% less VMT for every increment of new development. That is huge, 20 to 40%. It's not as big as the numbers that Jonathan provided, but it's of a magnitude with his, and based on different data sources. So if you take that VMT off 15%, that same chart I showed you before, looks a little better. The CO2 is still above that, which is blue, is still above the target line, CO2 target, but it's getting closer. So the question we ask in Chapter 8 is, what would it take to actually get down to the red line, which signifies that you're heading toward your goal of 80% reduction by 2050. And what it would take is compact development, which we've talked about. That's what I've been talking about, plus doubling transit, the transit service, plus doubling the price of using an automobile, for example, with a carbon tax or with a higher gasoline tax, plus having the amount of highway expansion. And that may surprise you a little bit, but it's probably the most important factor. As long as we're building highways for high-speed travel, I'm talking freeways, major arterials, we are going to drive more and more, because the faster you drive, the farther you will drive. And there's something called induced travel, which is when you widen roads or build new roads, you generate additional VMT beyond what you'd have otherwise. So if you put those together, you get a 38% reduction in VMT by 2030. Now, we haven't put those together. We haven't doubled funding for transit, doubled road pricing, and halved highway expansion as we roughly double density of development, but we're getting closer. So the Portland case study is an interesting one. Portland, I'm focusing on the city. Equally important is the region, but I'm going to talk about the city today. And its development plan is polycentric, center-based. All of those green little blobs you see are centers. And the planning for Portland and Portland Metro, the metropolitan area, has all been polycentric. And these centers are local density peaks. They're mixed use. So they have a mix of commercial and residential, or non-residential and residential. And so in the comprehensive plan for Portland, there are 200 references to centers, lest anyone miss the point. We need polycentric development to reduce VMT. Portland was the first in 1993, became the first city in the US to adopt a carbon mitigation strategy called carbon dioxide reduction strategy. It teamed with Multnomah County, which is the county surrounding Portland, on a climate action plan in 2001, and has been aggressive ever since then. And
just alert, excuse me, 3 minutes to go.
excuse me?
Just want to,
Three minutes to go. Okay, thank you. Multnomah County and Portland, as you can see, has been going down much more rapidly in terms of carbon emissions than the US as a whole. There are a lot of reasons for that. I could spend an hour talking about density and how Portland promotes it, mixed use, how Portland promotes it. The challenge is shown here, how to get down by 2050 to 80% below the 1990 level of carbon emissions. And that's a big drop. And Portland is doing it using urban forestry and solar and waste recycling and so on, but also transportation. And transportation is too important. It's 39% of CO2 emissions to be left out of the equation. What you'd have to do to get down to this is from around 2010, and it may have changed, but to get down to the level of VMT you need to meet the carbon target of Portland would be to reduce VMT from around 18 vehicle miles per person per day down to 6.7. And imagine how much that would affect lifestyles. To go from 18 to 6.7 is what is required or was required when the study was done by Portland to achieve its goals for CO2 reduction. And my last slide is quoting Michael Armstrong, saying, I know you all know about Portland, and Portland's kind of a model for the country in terms of planning, proactive planning. But Michael said even the Portland version of business as usual won't cut it, won't get down to the target level. So I'd love to talk about Portland and love to talk about what we're doing in Salt Lake City, and love to talk about Montgomery County, Maryland, and Eugene, and other places that are more successful than the rest of the country. But my time has run out.
Okay, thank you. It's good to know that there are some locations in the country that are headed in the right direction. Our next speaker is Jan Culbertson. Jan recently retired as a senior principal at A3C Collaborative Architecture. She volunteers in her hometown of Ann Arbor here as Leadership Council Chair for the Ann Arbor 2030 District, and is a member of the A2 Climate Partnership in the Ann Arbor Public Schools Sustainability Advisory Committee. Jan chairs the Scioto Township Planning Commission, their Environmental Sustainability Task Force, and serves on their Zoning Board of Appeals. Jan advocates at the state and national level for her profession and the environment as the co-chair of Michigan's Architectural Association's Government Advocacy Committee. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you. And I've really enjoyed the two presentations, and really respect urban planners. And as an architect, it was always a joy to share at the U of M, the College of Architecture and Urban Planning. Learn a lot looking at the larger region. And as an architect and in Ann Arbor and working with the Ann Arbor 2030 district, which for those of you that don't know, we partner with building owners to drive down their greenhouse gas emissions by reducing energy use, water use, and transportation. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the title of this is Climate, Housing, and Transportation. And the climate is really an urgent need right now, and our attention to really driving down our greenhouse gas emissions. And when you look at buildings in the scope of all of the global emissions, it really has kind of a small dot. However, buildings impact both the transportation, the mobility circle, and the industry circle. So they are important, and there are things that we can do very easily to reduce those emissions. And looking at Ann Arbor, buildings are even more important. And this is the 21, the last greenhouse gas inventory that was done. And if you look at, the combination of buildings, transportation, and housing, we have a majority of the emissions to work on. So this is, again, taken from the Cool Climate Berkeley study, but what the New York Times did is they took it down to the census tract level. And I think this is really important because it's a different way when the city of Ann Arbor looks at emissions. They look at the total energy use and the transportation piece. And what this study does it in a little different way. It's really based a lot on consumption. And so it talks about the housing and the transportation, but also the services, the food, and the goods, because those are also linked to manufacturing, our industries, and so forth. And so I think that's really an interesting way to look at, because our consumption is something that we individually can control. And so what that really says, and what both of the speakers talked about, was the connection between the density, carbon emissions, and transportation. And what I want to say is it's not just about the density, but is what and where things are. And the concept, this is to me really is easy to visualize if you think about a 15-minute city. And if you think of a 15-minute city, it's a city where everything is within a 15-minute bike or walking pattern. Now this, in large cities, this could be a neighborhood. In smaller cities, it could be the whole city. And so the whole idea is that you can walk, bike ride from any point in the city and find all the services that you need. And this will have a huge impact. And this is sort of the basis of the whole idea of a mixed use development. It's not a new idea, because if you look at some of the European and the very sort of church-centric cities of the 17th and 18th century, it's really an old kind of urban design. The 2030 district really looks at building emissions there's the transportation piece, but when you look at the buildings themselves, we kind of create three different buckets. The first bucket is new construction. And the immediate goal of new construction is to build zero net carbon buildings. We cannot invest in legacy carbon emissions. Existing buildings, we need to provide enough energy upgrades and electrification upgrades to transition the existing buildings. They have a lot of life left in them. And then also look at embodied carbon. And these are really looking at policies of how we build, and also the methods that we can use to reduce embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is really the CO2 and the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted during extraction, manufacture, transport, and construction, plus what happens at the end of life. So while we've made significant progress on reducing the operational emissions in buildings, we haven't made very much progress in understanding and being able to measure embodied carbon until now. And what's interesting about embodied carbon, and this is where the buildings kind of, join in the industry pie, is 23% of those emissions are just three materials: concrete, steel, and aluminum. So it's really important to think about the material choices we make in our buildings. So kind of a summary is, understanding building energy use, there's embodied, operating, and our transportation. So all of those are linked with our buildings. And this was the National Trust for Historic Preservation was one of the funders of this study that came out in 2011. And what it did for the very first time was trying to measure and inform the decision of renovating buildings versus building new. And what they found was, I think, really interesting. They did two different climate zones. They did Portland and they did Chicago, and they looked at building reuse from, from different types of buildings uses into new building uses. Now, there were a couple things that they kept the same. One, transportation didn't change, which if you change building uses, that will. And the new buildings and the existing buildings were the same size. However, the new buildings were 30% more energy efficient than the existing buildings. And the existing buildings were renovated. And what they found was there was a range of 10 to 80 years of having to operate at a greater efficiency to offset those embodied carbon emissions over the life of the building. So it really got people thinking about, the greenest building is an existing building. And that isn't to say that every building should stay, where it's functionally obsolete or whatever, but it does give us another metric to really look at in our planning. And the other thing that a lot of people don't quite realize is there have been quite a few studies, and I'll talk about a recent one, but really looking at both the embodied energy and the operational energy of high-rise buildings. And by high-rise buildings, I'm talking about 20 stories and more. And it's become relatively evident that the operational energy and the embodied energy, because the higher the building, the more steel, the concrete, you don't have other building material choices. So these high-rise buildings do consume and emit more carbon and greenhouse gases than the medium range buildings. There's one new study that was relatively interesting, and it was out of Halifax. It was called Buildings for the Climate Crisis. And it was a study about an urban area where they were looking at, do we demolish some buildings and build several high-rise towers? Now, this is over 20 feet or 20 stories. Or do we renovate the existing mid-rise buildings and infill with like 9 or 10-story buildings? And they found out when they did the calcs that the option for infill and renovating actually emit 40% less carbon than the new builds. Okay, and I'm not advocating that we don't build new, that we don't increase, I'm just saying that we need to do some carbon, especially embodied carbon metrics when we make our decisions. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is this whole density stuff. Put it in perspective. When people say, and several of these looking at density and so forth said, okay, Paris, that's sort of, you can do low rise and you can get incredible density with mid-rise buildings. But compare, Ann Arbor's density of, about 4,600 people per square mile with Paris, New York, Detroit, and Chicago. If you compare, the small cities, which Ann Arbor is, with the density of small cities in the US, we're really kind of in the middle, okay? Which, if you go back to what Reid was saying and what Jonathan was saying, there is a lot of room for infill and increasing the density within Ann Arbor, but it's where and how we do it that's important. And remembering that Ann Arbor isn't in isolation, we really have to work with the surrounding region, because we have 40,000 people that commute into Ann Arbor each day. Talk about trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled. We're an employment destination for an awful lot of people. Going back to how we build, I think for quite some time, both the city and the university and a lot of architects and designers have used LEED as sort of their sustainable building standard. And LEED has evolved a great deal, improving its energy targets and so forth. But I want to put out the whole idea of we need to go beyond sustainable. This is sort of conventional construction. People call it green kind of housing or green construction, sustainable construction, sort of this idea of net zero. And I think the trajectory really needs to be into more of a restorative landscape and a regenerative landscape. We have done so much damage to our earth in development that we really need to take a longer view in how we build, where we build, and look at some new goals. And I did want to point out that there is an example of this in Ann Arbor. It's called Viridian at County Farm Park. And what the Living Building Challenge does is it looks at equity, the materials, the restoring healthy relationships with nature, the idea of beauty and aesthetics, looking at that water and energy. You try and look at a net positive use of those. And and I think the other thing that's important to, as we're thinking about where and how we build, is cities also have to have their renewable power. And it is much easier to create an on-site net zero building at a mid-rise than it is to do it. The more stories you add, the harder it is to have the on-site renewables. And so one of the things that I know in Scioto Township we're looking at too is, where is the land, as well as the building roofs and so forth, to enable us to have our, I would say, locate as much renewable energy sources, on site, as opposed to, having to import energy from, the plain states or the more rural areas. So I just want to leave you with that. It's important to look at not only where we build, what we build, but how we build. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Just a reminder that questions have been coming in, but as you have questions, you can submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Our next speaker is Chris Laurent. Chris leads Cinnaire's nonprofit development affiliate called Cinnaire Solutions, which works across multiple states, including particular focus in Detroit. Cinnaire Solutions' model is to partner with undercapitalized or capacity limited commercial development companies or emerging development firms owned by persons of color, serving to help its partners transform their communities. Chris's previous experience includes numerous leadership positions in Wisconsin and Illinois related to the development of affordable housing. He serves on the boards of many nonprofits, too numerous to mention here, such as the Wisconsin Coalition Against Homelessness. Welcome, Chris.
Hey, thanks. Of course, the dogs just started barking as soon as I got started. So I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, actually, technically Oregon, Wisconsin, about 15 minutes south, like Reid. I was scheduled to come out today, and the weather is coming your way. So not too bad. Sounds like you guys are faring worse than we. We sort of did a last minute audible to talk about the order. I'm glad we did. I can touch on a couple of points that previous speakers have mentioned. As Clark had said, Cinnaire is a 501c3 nonprofit headquartered in Lansing, Michigan. Our bread and butter business has always been investing in low-income housing tax credits. We started as a $10 million fund with the state of Michigan and have grown from there to a $5 billion organization. Fundamentally, we received something called CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution status from the Department of Treasury about 15 years ago, and really had a wholesale change in the way that we approached our work. Fundamentally, we've decided strategically that our mission statement, or sort of our why statement, is that we believe all people deserve the opportunities provided by living in healthy communities. So we do housing, but we do significantly more than housing. So we really try to think systematically about the way that we do our work. So our team really focuses when we have new opportunities that come before us, and we work throughout the footprint of the upper Midwest, mid-Atlantic states, with Wilmington, Delaware sort of as a core, but we're doing work in Camden, New Jersey. We focus on the 5 pillars on the left: people, place, partnerships, pioneering, trying to be the first in whatever we're doing, and then prosperity for everybody. And again, it's very systematic, systemic, and holistic. So here's our team. We are a small but mighty team of 13 scattered. We have 3 or 4 people in Madison, about the same in Detroit, folks on one guy in Chicago, somebody in DC, and then the balance in our Wilmington, Delaware office. And so we work really by trying to understand communities, understand what their challenges are, recognizing a lot of the communities we're working with lack trust. People have made a lot of promises and haven't delivered on those. And so the first step really is building trust. We say trust is our currency. So a couple examples of developments that we've done, just to give you a sense that we don't do one thing. I'm happy to hear that the best, greenest, friendly approach to problem solving is making existing buildings perform better. So this is not far from our corporate offices in Lansing, Allen Place, using something called New Markets Tax Credits as the driver. We added 19 units of housing attainable for the neighborhood, income sort of scattered throughout, a food-centric environment with sort of a farmer's market, commercial kitchen, food pack system, and a federally qualified healthcare center. So serve folks on the east side of Lansing, not to be confused with East Lansing, can walk to get their services nearby. The umbrella things that you can't see on the outside are, this was done in conjunction with the Board of Water and Light local to Lansing. They provided some grant funds where we have charging stations that are powered by the sun. A development in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Mississippi River town that I'll come back to use as a couple of case studies. Development reclaiming some vacant sites not far from City Brewing, where Heileman's Brewing Company was located for a long time. Development that targets its focus on otherwise homeless people. Solomon's Court is a 2-phase development in Wilmington, Delaware. A lot of focus on Wilmington right now because the president obviously is there. Grassroots effort, incorporating a lot of local employment folks in conjunction with the Delaware State Housing Association. This is a development you may be familiar with, partnering with Little Caesars as a development arm, Olympia Development of Michigan, just outside of the district Detroit, or actually part of the district Detroit. Buildings from the 1850s being rehabbed on Henry Street. We secured low-income housing tax credits from MISTA, Michigan State Housing Development Association or Authority. Reuse, bringing these buildings up to code. This is really the first significant development that provides walkability to residents to the downtown. Jump across the Freeway 75 and you're on Woodward. Real access to all parts of Detroit. Development, Camden, New Jersey, headquarters of Campbell Soup. Sort of innovative about 10 years ago for new policing efforts to really do community-based policing, significantly reduced incidents of crime, but a development in a neighborhood called Parkside that's anchored by 2 healthcare organizations. Healthcare, like I'm sure you're experiencing right now in Ann Arbor, and school systems are really challenged with being able to provide affordability close to work. And so this is, again, within walking distance of virtual Lords. And the hope of the campus is to be able to have easy access to employees and use it as a retention. It's a little bit different from the other developments that I've shown in that it's a greenfield development. Most of what we do is inner city infill. This is the Meadows, Darlington, but it's one of a handful of developments using affordable housing tax credits with USDA Section 514 program for farm workers. So Southwest Wisconsin has some of the largest concentrations of productive dairy farms in the country, and they too have a hard time attracting employees because there's a real shortage of affordable housing. Those of you who know Detroit might know La Jolla Gardens in Southwest Detroit. We're partnering with the local business association and Invest Detroit to provide a community-centric development with about 60 homes. We're closing this next week. It's been a long, kind of brutal run right now with supply chain challenges. It's a development I'd done previously to joining Cinnaire in Sturgeon Bay, which is the thumb that goes out to Door County. Lots of common space. We try to concentrate our community spaces where more people use them to foster an enhanced sense of community. So that's up on the left-hand side, you can see a railings, but a mixed-use development. This has got easy access to Green Bay, which is part of Lake Michigan, and Outfitters relocated here. And again, this business surprisingly is a center sort of hub of the community. So residents get a discount for renting kayaks and purchasing equipment at his store, and they're able to use it just across the street. As part of our sort of what drives us, and I think one of the focal points that I can share is we've talked a lot about policy and sort of the global need, but at the end of the day, new technology costs money. I have not yet talked to somebody, an architect is an advocate of passive house design, who hasn't said it's revenue neutral. And as we've bid a handful of developments, probably 6, there's always a 15 to 25% cost increase for adding those technologies. Having said that, though, particularly in lower income areas, this is at 28th and Wright on the near northwest side of Milwaukee. We developed Dr. Wesley Scott Senior Living Community. We used what was originally an AT&T Telegraph community, the former home of the Milwaukee Urban League, in conjunction with a new construction development to the west, 84 units of senior housing for people living in the community. Of note is at the time it was built, which is probably 15 years ago now, the panels that you see are PV. This was the largest residential solar photovoltaic array in the state of Wisconsin. So and there's also a little bit of sort of homage to a green roof on the top with some sedum trays, but we really wanted to advance the community. And because my objective in the planning was, let's pay for the cost of the elevator. If nothing else, elevator, 3-phase, huge draw. If we can offset that, we're making a difference. This is a development in La Crosse, Wisconsin, Gun Brewery Lofts on the National Register of Historic Places. Again, in an attempt to try to attract the community to the work that we're doing, this is actually solar hot water. Solar hot water accounts for about 40% of the energy costs of buildings from an owner's perspective. And so offsetting that would help us, reduce rents to some extent. Again, in the city of La Crosse, this is called Grand River Station. It was a joint venture done with the city of La Crosse, 72 units of housing targeting artists, and then a bus transit hub on the first floor, along with about 20,000 square feet of commercial. La Crosse, for those of you not familiar with Wisconsin, is about 2.5 hours northwest of Wisconsin, Madison, about halfway between Madison and the Twin Cities. It is challenged. It's a community of about 50,000 people, MSA, about the size of Ann Arbor, 150,000 people. It's long and linear. And so for folks with limited transportation, getting around is a real challenge. Grand River Station sort of halfway between north and south. And you can see one of the elements we added, less for, to some extent, maybe for stormwater detention and management, but more just for peace of mind. Direct access on the 4th floor, which sits on top of parking. But if you look at it from Google Earth, it looks like ground level, but that's actually a green roof with large caliper size trees. 72 units, about $23 million in 2010. Most of the rents targeted households at or below 60% of area median income. For Ann Arbor, just relatively speaking, 1-person household, 49,500, up to 4-person household, 70,680. So back to the Mr. Rogers song, this is really who are the people in your neighborhood. People at these income levels are what make your community tick. The story about Gun Brewery Lofts I like to share is that there was a resident, that was done in conjunction with Gunderson Lutheran Hospital. And so formerly, I know I'm at about 3 minutes, the folks, there was an employee who worked in, I think she was a medical x-ray tech, had lived in Galesville, about half an hour from work. And so she'd drive every day, had childcare. So she had to drop her kid off at childcare. Took her a long time. Traffic, her car was unpredictable. She was able to live on campus, walk to work, and the community provided daycare. So again, thinking holistically, the woman saved significant amounts of dollars, provided, good care for her kid that was within walking distance of where she lived and accessible to her place of employment. This is my daughter, Jordan. She actually lived in both of the 2 developments that I talked about. So when we talk about affordable housing, there's really a face that we can put to that. Jordan graduated. La Crosse is blessed with 3 organizations of higher education, University of Wisconsin, La Crosse, Viterbo University, where I'm pursuing my master's in servant leadership, and then a tech college. And so WCT, all those communities, all those institutions have strong needs for employees. So when you're thinking about Ann Arbor and what is necessary, think about those people and how they can get to work. This has been said a couple times right now. The 2 big costs that particularly households at or below 60% or even 100% of area median income, 2 biggest expenditures are housing and transportation. And so we try to address those. The other big part of sort of providing healthy living communities that we're really focused on is overall health experiences and providing exercise opportunities for them, living in spaces that are good for mental health, like the green spaces I showed, really show commitment to overall holistic health. This is just on the Department of Transportation. Looking forward, one of the things, the architect for the first development in La Crosse that I showed you, Jason Korb, just completed a development called The Ascent. Again, thinking holistically, the developer was actually New Land Enterprises out of Milwaukee, but just built the world's tallest timber frame building, which, like a lot of things that are new, sounds innovative and fresh and maybe unproven, but the building sequesters through green growth. And you remember the previous slide, I think Jan had shown the cost that we pay in carbon for concrete. This development actually takes advantage of carbon that's trapped in trees. It takes about 25 minutes to grow this volume of wood used here in North American forests. The other sort of interesting story, it's on substandard soils. The amount of pilings, because the building weighed less, because there was less concrete in it, it was all timber frame construction. The developer estimates that it put about 100 fewer pilings in the ground, which are by themselves noisy. It take a lot of energy. You can imagine the amount of energy to pound into the bedrock. That saves significant carbon emissions as well. With that, I think we're good to address questions.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. We've had some questions coming in, and I've got a few prepared. First one's for Jan. In order to build more housing and improve non-motorized infrastructure, we sometimes have to cut down trees, but trees are important in fighting climate change. How can we minimize tree removal? Oh, Jan,
Yep. Yeah, that, that's a pretty core question. And one of the things is, and this gets into, sort of state jurisdiction, and a lot of Ann Arbor actually has a pretty good tree ordinance. And one of the things that tree ordinances don't do is actually use the calculating that you can do now for sequestration. And I think one of the ideas that we really need to explore is, and this has to do with calculating the embodied carbon, but also the sequestration of the trees that are getting removed. Goal 1 is don't build on greenfield sites. Develop in areas where you have infrastructure. It's just very hard to zone out sort of land rights. And I don't know, if other people have some ideas on that, but I mean, it's very clear what we need to do. We need to build, where we've already built and where we have infrastructure and where we have transportation. And the question is, how do you disincentivize building on greenfield sites?
Okay, thank you. A question for Chris. How can we make sure with these new developments, we don't push out minority, culturally rich neighborhoods?
Yeah, I think it's a real issue. As I said, I think our first thing that we try to do is really get in, understand the neighborhood, build trust. We're working with Olympia right now. That was a real concern for the Henry Street buildings that we talked about, and we'll make commitments and honor them. So really trying to understand what the community's goals are, what the city's goals are, and then work to retain. And these are communities. A lot of the opportunities that we see right now are communities that have been gentrified, where folks have been either intentionally or unintentionally forced out.
Okay, thank you. Another question for Reid. With well-planned development that's desirable, more sustainable, more dense, how can we be sure people won't drive anyway through habit, even though they are living in a supposedly a walkable, bike-friendly, and mass transit region? People's habits are hard to break.
If you go back far enough, go back to the time when we started studying the relationship between the built environment and travel, there were people who, academics, happened to be at USC, a number of them, who said people are going to drive like crazy regardless of what we do as planners. That was the mid-90s. And since then, there have been, as I said before, hundreds of studies that show that people aren't going to drive like crazy if you have all 5 D variables working for you. So I didn't mention the Ds, but Jan had commented on the fact that Jonathan and I focused on density. I hope I said mixed use as much as I said density, but the Ds are density, land use diversity or mixed use, street design, network design, individual street design, destination accessibility, how close things are to you, high walk score, for example, 15-minute city, and distance from transit. And all 5 of those things, when you have them working for you, reduce VMT automatically. You don't have to impose any restrictions on travel, whatever. If you have the D variables working for you, you can cut the amount of travel by car, not quite in half, but on that order. And so we know this. We've studied transit-oriented developments around the country in Seattle and Los Angeles and San Francisco and Washington, D.C. And we know that people living, and there is a catch to this, which I'll come back to, but people living in these TODs, which are right transit-oriented developments, which are right next to stations, make about half as many vehicle trips as comparable people living in the suburbs do, and they require about half as much parking. And it's a function of the built environment. We know it makes a difference, and we've proven it by studying mixed-use developments, by studying transit-oriented developments, by studying new communities, and so on. So I think people will drive like crazy. Whatever we do just isn't borne out by the evidence.
Reid, I can add a couple kind of anecdotal comments. I lived in Portland when they had a quit. I think you got to make it easy for people. For a while, the streetcar downtown was free. When they started charging $1, which is not much, everybody's habits changed. They thought, well, I'll just walk if I got to pay $1 for this. Similarly, when I have to go to Chicago, it's easier for me to drive to Milwaukee and take the train, take the Hiawatha into the city than it is to park. So I think that should be part of the calculation. What's easiest for the consumer? I think you're right. People will still love to drive, but at the end of the day, they'll choose whatever choice makes the most sense for them.
And people, what we found was people living in, and I'll focus on the TODs right now, do own cars. They own fewer cars. It's about 1 per apartment rather than 2 per apartment, or 1.5. But they don't use the cars as much. So the cars sit there during the week. They use transit to get to work, and then on weekends they take the car out for some recreational opportunity. So my point is just that we have a lot of evidence now, due to the work of Jonathan and Robert Cervero and other names you've heard before, and the evidence speaks for itself.
Okay. This one for Jonathan, but there could be other comments too. How do we know it will work if we don't have good transit in the location? Like, do we need transit first in order to encourage the development?
In high demand places, and Ann Arbor is one of those high demand places, there is a lot of demand for denser, more mixed use development, even if the transit isn't there. I would say that our job is to accommodate that development and reap the vehicle miles traveled benefits of location, and then it makes sure that we extend the transit to those areas. It would be a shame to say, oh no, we don't have the AAATA bus doesn't run to this area, therefore we're going to keep low density regulations. Instead, I think we should say, let's allow higher density development, let's create the need for more transit, and then make sure that the transit is there.
Okay. Chris, do you want to look at some of the ones that have come in from the audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Clark. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to ask some questions, some other questions that came in from the audience. And just a real quick one first for Jan. Can you just make sure we all know what you mean by mid-rise?
Sure. Typically, mid-rise goes up to 10 stories. And yeah, and the whole embodied, that it's not clear, the 10 to 20 stories, that's it, but it's very clear that the 20 above, and certainly the mid-rise, it's the stuff in between that the research isn't as clear on.
Okay, thanks. And then since you said the word embodied, I'm going to ask a question about that. So you talked about the embodied energy of buildings. What about when you put them all together in this dense way and you get the embodied energy of cities? Isn't that a large proportion of energy? And also the energy effect of all the impervious surfaces within the city, which then creates the heat island effect. I guess those are kind of three questions.
And this is, this is where it is really important to make sure there's a balance of open and green space, and it's equally accessible to everyone. And the type of materials you use in a city, for instance, if all your streets are asphalt, you have your heat island effect is great. The other thing is roofs. We did in our old architecture firm, I called it the zebra roof, and we had multiple different types of green roofs and different colors of roof temperature, roofing from black to gray to, and what was startling to me was even the green roof that had like the matte, it wasn't a deep green roof, the temperature never went below freezing and it never went above 80, where the black roof was like 120, 140 degrees in the summertime. And the white roofs were, in the, a little higher in between that. But just the idea of the green was amazing in what it did. And so, yeah, the materials we use are incredibly important.
Thanks. Here's one for Jonathan. Back in your early slides, you used a lot of figures and comparisons having to do with carbon emissions of different kinds of cities and whatnot. Did you do any normalization values, or was it just pretty much straight carbon values? Did you normalize by population or anything?
It's per household, and it's really important to emphasize the per household or per capita perspective. So often when we have environmental debates, implicitly we seek to reduce environmental impact per acre. And I would offer that it's really environmental impact per capita or environmental impact per household that matters. Here's the reason why, very simple. Total environmental impact equals environmental impact per capita times the number of people we have in the country. Well, I don't think that land use planning directly affects the amount of people that we have in the country, but it surely affects environmental impacts per capita. So if we want to reduce environmental impacts total, our job is to reduce environmental impacts per capita, and or per household, and that's the way these data were normalized.
Great, thanks. Reid, somebody had a question about vehicle miles traveled. And you talked a lot about vehicle miles traveled as a variable for controlling carbon emissions. What about the idea of using hybrid or EV vehicles? So in other words, is it good enough to not worry about vehicle miles traveled and if we all went to EVs?
No, I think that was the point I was trying to make at the very beginning when I talked about the three-legged stool. And remember, one leg was VMT, the amount of driving we do, but a second leg was the carbon content of fuels, and the third leg was the efficiency terms of miles per gallon of our energy source. So no, you can't get to these reductions. Remember I said 4.6 or was 6.4 vehicle miles per person for Portland to meet its objective. You can't you can't get there with the other two legs of the stool, but
Mhm.
doing nothing about urban sprawl and rising VMT.
Great, thanks. And Chris, how might you address the argument that we shouldn't build new housing unless it's all solar ready and ready to have heat pumps and is ultra efficient so that it's meeting the sort of building being carbon friendly versus the idea of it being in the right place, being carbon friendly? Do we have to make sure all the new building in our infill areas are solar and everything?
You're asking this, Chris, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
as opposed to you.
Of
And it was rhetorical. Yeah, you know, I'm all for advancing the technologies as long as we're not sort of blind to the fact that it costs more money right now. So you remember Mayor Daley said that all new buildings had to have green roofs a few years ago. And I think the city of Chicago said, we'll stand behind that with additional resources. I think Detroit's been very forthcoming. It gets really challenging when policymakers layer in a lot of extra stuff and say, you figure it out. And then that creates barriers to entry. So
Right.
just gotta prioritize resources. And
Mhm.
I think the other thing that we're finding right now, I know I made a comment about passive houses. I think a lot of that is education and understanding. You know, I'm sort of in the trenches, and when contractors don't understand things, they throw big dollars at it because they say this is going to cost me time or money, and I'll do it, but I don't want to lose money on it. And so when we're looking at passive house right now in Wilmington, we're budgeting education for the contractors so they know there's a sequencing to doing things. Because when you're doing passive house, the window sealants are different. The sequencing of when contractors come in is different. And so planning for that and going through it a couple of times, we hope will reduce cost over time. I think there was a comment, someone did it for $186 a foot a while ago. We've heard that too. And everything's contextual too, right? I mean, $186 in Detroit is very different from $186 in Camden, New Jersey. Our costs right now are for $400 a foot in New Jersey.
Okay, right. Any of the other panelists have thoughts on that? And also, can some of that gap in resources be filled through the new IRA Act, the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple things about that. And we're trying to get also the word out to the design community about the Inflation Reduction Act, because with the 30% rebates, especially on like geo-exchange, thermal storage, there are now systems that we need to start looking at and comparing, which were not on the table before because of cost. So I think that's very important. And Chris, I think that's very valid. We have, you know, the construction industry is an industry that has evolved very minimally. And it's sort of chicken and the egg, right? If the volume isn't there, if, you know, it's the path of least resistance. And people want to do things the way they've always done them because it's easier. And unfortunately, you know, I think it's a combination of owners and policymakers and design professionals and contractors saying, stop, time out. We haven't made the progress we needed to make. And there are, you know, we had Tim McDonald from Onion Flats speak several times about the passive, the passive buildings that he's done, and has been able to now, the Philadelphia Housing Authority has been promoting passive house, and they've gotten the latest bids have come in actually below you know, their traditional construction, but it's taken them probably about 5 years, to do that.
I would just like to add in the dimension about jurisdictions. I think it's very important to do this in concert with other jurisdictions in the region. Here's why. Imagine Ann Arbor loads on environmental requirements for buildings, and the townships and the suburbs don't. Well, we could have perniciously, we could be inducing greater development in the high carbon areas in order ostensibly to save carbon. So if we work together, either as a region or even better at the state level, I think we have a chance of not inducing those undesirable effects.
Well, that leads me to one of these questions that was asked a little bit later, but I think it feeds right into it, which is there's a couple. One is, what can the city council do to help implement a lot of these ideas that you're talking about? So let's go with that one. And this is for any of you, because you all talked about great activities that cities need to do.
The city council has a lot of power in this regard. I guess it's, in a sense, it's good news. Now, the land use approaches are not short-term approaches. So we don't solve the problem this month with land use approaches. They are long-term approaches to guide the city as it evolves. But the city can revise zoning codes to allow for denser development, which doesn't necessarily mean high-rise development. In fact, one of the greatest potentials for denser development is unlocking the single-family zone for medium density development throughout. We have, in the United States, we zone phenomenal quantities of our territory, of our metropolitan territory, for single family only. It has a rather sordid and racist history about why we do that. I think revising it is a moral imperative, and a number of cities have begun undoing the damage that's been done with single family zoning. I think that is a first step towards using the majority of our territory, not just a few parcels downtown, to accommodate more neighbors in our lower carbon zone.
One thing that I totally agree. For local government, the first and foremost answer is forming zoning, allowing mixed use by right, allowing maybe eliminating single family zoning or increasing zoning minimums. And there are lots of really great ideas that have to do with zoning. Zoning ultimately affects the number of cars, parking spaces, developer needs to provide, which no one has mentioned, I don't think. But obviously that drives up the cost of housing, where you have minimum parking ratios that are high, 2 per apartment, that kind of thing. Density bonuses. I wrote a paper recently on the different growth management tools and how effective they are. And density bonuses, form-based codes, tax increment financing, transfer of development rights, urban containment policies, impact fees, a whole bunch of things that the city council can manipulate. Priority funding areas, adequate public facilities ordinances. It's in a paper published in the Journal of Planning Literature, Growth Management Effectiveness, and the toolbox is large, but number one is zoning. And if we begin to relax zoning restrictions, we will ultimately make housing more affordable, which is something we haven't talked much about today. But housing affordability is a huge issue where I am in Salt Lake City,
Mhm.
a huge issue everywhere actually right now. And it's in part due to zoning.
Mhm.
The amount of single family zoning, the large setbacks, etc., all drives up the cost of housing and makes it less affordable. And ultimately, we're going to have to answer this, this challenge having to do with carbon. We're going to have to make city living in what Jonathan referred to, I think, is the low carbon areas, affordable for people who have moderate and low incomes.
I'm going to follow that up with a two-tiered question, which is looking at outside the cities and in the more urban or rural areas. I happen to be a trustee in Ann Arbor Township, which is surrounding the city, and it considers itself a rural area. And Jan is a planning commissioner in Scioto Township, which is just outside the city. And so, what if we manage to have all of our future development in the city and in urban areas compact and high density? Then what do we do with the sprawl that's already in place, like the single family homes on larger lots that are still out there? Can they be retrofitted? Can we somehow make them more low carbon?
Short answer
That's
is
for anybody.
yeah, the short answer to that question is yes. The longer answer is that's actually how cities have evolved throughout history. Every city, with the exception of the master plan cities, started as a little village that grew out and grew up and kept on transforming. We keep our regulations keep the suburbs locked in place. For example, with minimum lot sizes. There have been experiments with dropping lot sizes that vastly increase supplies of housing and hence affordability of housing, with restricting regulations on redevelopment. So I think the key is not to view our cities as having a final form, because cities are in constant process of evolution, and focus on those rules that tend to unproductively hold a particular form in place.
I think that my answer would be a little different than Jonathan's. I think when you build housing at very low densities, you're kind of stuck with it. This is Chris Nelson's work, Jonathan, looking at how long commercial properties last, their lifespan versus residential. I happen to live in a house that's over 100 years old, and in 100 years, this house will be here occupied by someone else. But commercial or non-residential property turns over much faster. And what we're seeing, and yeah, I thought someone might say, what are the good places in the country in terms of these policies? And one of them that isn't bad, oddly enough, is Salt Lake City. We're getting tremendous redevelopment, particularly along our light rail lines. And I don't think we've talked enough about transportation today, providing light rail, heavy rail, bus rapid transit, whatever. What's being redeveloped in the city is not residential single family neighborhoods. What's being redeveloped is industrial land, commercial land, etc. And the lifespan of that is not 100 years, but around 30 years. So there's a real potential to redevelop commercial or non-residential areas that really doesn't exist to the same extent in residential neighborhoods.
So one of the trends that we've been following is sort of the reemergence of second or third tier cities. And I say that like with proximity to the city center right now, I think when I started in this career 30 years ago, Milwaukee and Madison were the two areas of focus. And I think we're seeing those communities further out stabilizing, if not growing, because the schools tend to be at least perceived as stronger, and employment's much more flexible, particularly in a post-pandemic world. I think there's also been investment in infrastructure, internet. And so communities that had virtually no housing demand 10 years ago, right now I'm seeing sustained, 72 unit developments at a time. So we're following that pretty closely. And I think that sort of triggers maybe better quality restaurants. So more choices for better quality things. So you don't have to go in the city. Folks are staying closer to home. So I think that's an element that's out there too.
Due to growth of population and redevelopment of commercial property and new development of commercial property, we estimated in Growing Cooler that 2/3 of the development on the ground in 2050 would have been built in this century. So that sounds so high, like 2/3. Are you kidding? When the built environment changes slowly over time, everyone says, but thanks to particularly growth and particularly redevelopment of commercial properties, we really do have the ability to reduce carbon emissions per capita, great way to measure it, or per household, substantially just in this century through 2050.
Thanks. And then I had a follow-up to that in terms of out in the township areas and the more rural areas, what are the suite of tools that they can adopt? And I'm thinking about, is there a yin to the yang of high density development, the yin being farmland and open space protection? Or are we talking about developing densely everywhere?
I think we're
go ahead, Reid.
That's very
no. You go ahead.
I think we could distinguish between town centers in rural areas and development that's simply remote and not close to anything and not serving agricultural purposes. So I think the task is to focus development in those areas, and we have town centers that really are quite walkable in those in our rural areas, and work on protection of open space that's more remote.
Thank you. I have a question for Jan. When you were talking about the mid-rise buildings and the embedded carbon, do you have? We're wondering if you can comment on the mass timber construction as a possible means of reducing embodied carbon in new construction.
Yeah, it definitely does. And Michigan State.
Actually, if I could back you up, can you just define what we mean by mass timber? I mean, I know what those two words mean.
Yeah. Yeah, mass timber is it kind of goes back to like the old barns where you had, big timber, and instead of it being a singular piece of wood, it is a wood that is, glued, or wood, waste wood products that are pressed together. And so it's a combination of those things. So you're not taking these, huge trees and like they did in the old days. So, there aren't a lot of, right now, mass timber works really well if you're in the Northwest. There's manufacturing production in Georgia. Michigan State has been trying to, support some sort of manufacturing in Michigan, because we do have a wood products group. But it's starting any manufacturing process, it takes capital. and it takes demand. Also the building codes are changing. The next version of the codes, each one has been increasing heights, and there's actually a mass timber building type now in the codes, but the 2024 code is the one that really allows the higher rise buildings. And people say, well, what about fire and all this kind of stuff? Well, you know, when you have a chunk of wood, it chars.
Yeah.
It doesn't collapse. So, but again, there are two things that need to happen, you know, with building construction, and this will help the passive house too, is we haven't been able to manufacture in you know, panelized construction and that type of thing. You can increase the quality, you can increase the insulation and all of these things, but it's part of that. How do we invest, and how, you know, it's chicken and egg. You need to have the projects, you need to have the workforce, you know, it's transforming that construction industry. So both of those are important. And yes, the other thing they're looking at is sequestering actually carbon in building materials.
Right. A question for Professor Levine. Is investor housing purchasing a concern in this sort of chain of housing that you were discussing? So
That's a really interesting question.
Okay.
I would distinguish between, let's first off ask why housing is such a lucrative target for investment and my answer is it's artificially scarce because of the way we zone. In other words, the way to deal with it, to the extent that we think that investor housing is a problem, the way to deal with it is to make it less good of a deal by allowing more housing in our highly accessible areas. It's the supply constraints that really make it so lucrative. And yet, investor housing is most problematic if the housing remains vacant. If I'm an investor and I say, listen, I think tenants would just be a problem in this house, I'm just going to hold it vacant, I would consider that to be a problem. If I invest in the house and I put it back in the rental market, then I'm not taking a house off the market. So that would be considerably less problematic. So potential problems, but I think the reason why housing is target for investment is a symptom of a deeper problem, and that is why housing is artificially scarce.
Housing supply. What about this Airbnb issue? So with our Airbnbs and those sorts of things, is that a similar issue with taking away residences?
I looked at the numbers in Ann Arbor, and my impression on the numbers in Ann Arbor is that is nowhere near the primary cause of the housing shortage in Ann Arbor. Our land use regulatory approach is the primary cause of our housing shortage in Ann Arbor. So I feel like it's something that we do that is controlling Airbnbs because we're unwilling to treat the deeper problem, and that is what is constraining the housing supply in our highly accessible and lower carbon areas.
Okay, Reid, you talked about the 4 wonderful cities that have been doing everything right? The Portland, Montgomery, Salt Lake City, and Eugene. Can you mention some of the tools that they're either doing that are similar or differently in their pursuit of lower carbon targets?
The key is the D variables. And if you look at, as an example, Arlington, Virginia, you've got all the Ds. You've got metro, so distance to transit working for you. You've got density, mid-rise, high-rise. You've got mixed use, and Clarendon and Ballston and so on and so on. So there are a lot of places that I think do pretty well with respect to the Ds, but the Ds are what we have to keep in mind. And, you know, I mean, yeah, there are places in this country, there are two in our region that require a certain degree of street connectivity, which is design, the D variable design. And I live in the avenues, and we've got small blocks, and we've got mostly, almost all entirely four-way intersections, which add to connectivity and so on. So when I think about places that are doing well, Seattle comes to mind as a place that's very progressive in its codes. The codes address all of the Ds. The one thing we haven't talked about, to my surprise, is form-based codes, which do increase, and I'm bringing them up not because I think they're, you know, the ultimate panacea, but they do create well-designed streets because buildings are moved up to the back of sidewalk rather than set back behind parking. They typically include mixed use. They are denser and so on. So places, if I were looking for places to emulate, I would look at places that, like Salt Lake, that are going heavily into form-based codes as opposed to conventional zoning, which Jonathan has critiqued so eloquently. So there are, so I brought up transit, I brought up form-based codes and so on, affordable housing. We shouldn't lose sight of those other tools or approaches that we need to take to produce affordable, high mobility, accessible, sustainable, equitable places. So all of those things. We want mobility, we want accessibility, we want sustainability, we want equity, and we want livability. All of them are important, and we should consider all of them as we deal with a sustainability problem, which is carbon, excessive carbon pollution.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question. Even though we have quite a few more and you all have been so incredibly informative. So the US seems to have a love affair with, large houses on large lots with the picket fence in the yard and lots of space. That's what it seems like people feel like will make them happy. So I wonder if any of you could address this and the whole idea of, lifestyle satisfaction, living in a high density area. Can people be happier with higher density? What about all that noise and all those people all over the place?
May I jump in with just the National Association of Realtors, which is hardly an environmental group, every couple of years does a survey where they say, would you prefer to live in neighborhood A or neighborhood B? In neighborhood B, neighborhood A is large lots, single family, you have to drive everywhere. The roads are strictly for cars, etc. And the other one is mixed housing types, mixed use, where you can walk to the store, where you have complete streets, and so on. And consistently, the mixed use, mixed income, complete streets neighborhood is preferred to the sprawl neighborhood consistently. And that goes back to about 2012 or so, maybe even earlier than that. And you might have thought that perhaps COVID would change it. Well, they did a survey during the COVID pandemic, and people still prefer urban living to suburban sprawl.
I would underline what Reid said and say, listen, we have the evidence right here in our own housing market. If in fact that were the universally held American dream, big house, large lot, big car, remote living, etc., why would we have such high demand for living in a place like Ann Arbor? Why is there such demand for living in a place like San Francisco, and which doesn't even let in a fraction of the demand of that would ultimately want to reside there? So the narrative that there is an American dream goes against what we're actually observing in housing markets and the behavior of the desirable places, the desirable cities that seem to be fighting off density. That demand comes from somewhere, and I would say there are different American dreams, and the playing field maybe is tilting towards the one that Reid is describing.
All right, I am going to have to leave it at that. Thank you, folks, so much for all of this information. Thanks for all the participants and the attendees who came. We have a slide coming up that will show you how to get involved with Citizens Climate Lobby. And if you have any questions that didn't get answered or you'd like to continue to discuss this, use that really cool QR code, which I just learned how to create the other day.
And the recording will be available sometime in the future, if people want to review it or tell their friends to watch it.
Yeah, we had so many great questions. We didn't get to nearly all of them. We will send like a follow-up email to those if you click this link or scan this code or use this URL and give us your email address, or send us an email at this Ann Arbor at citizensclimatelabbey.org, and we will send a follow-up email with as much information as we can.
Thanks to CCL for organizing. It's terrific.
Thank you guys so much for your great information, and I will turn it back to Zach for the final word.
All I have to say is thank you also, CCL, for organizing. Folks, we've got 3 more of these coming up at the end of March, end of April, and end of May. You can find more information at a2gov.org/sustainability/events. That's also where you can find the recordings for each event, including tonight's. So thank you, panelists, for joining us, and thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a wonderful evening, and stay safe out there.
Yes, thank you so much to our panelists for your time and your work on this. It's such an important topic, and we really appreciate you giving us your wisdom. Thanks.